All right, let's jump right into a puzzle that I think anyone in a helping profession, coaches, managers, therapists, has run into. We're going to explore why sometimes the very act of trying to help someone doesn't just fail, it can actually make things worse. I mean, you know the feeling, right? You're in a session, you're offering support, you think you're asking all the perfect open-ended questions, and then instead of that big breakthrough, you just get crickets. Or worse, confusion, maybe even a total shutdown. So what on earth is going on there?
Okay, so our go-to explanations are usually pretty standard. We think, oh, my technique was off, or maybe we just don't have enough rapport. Or, and this is a big one, we label the other person as resistant. We figure they just haven't hit that big aha moment yet. And look, maybe those things play a part, but what we're digging into today suggests that these explanations, they're kind of missing the real story.
Yeah, they miss the point because there's a deeper, much more fundamental dynamic at play here. And that's what we're calling the helping paradox. So here it is, the core idea for this whole explainer. What if the problem isn't the technique? What if the problem is the help itself? I know, it sounds totally backward, but just stick with me on this one. All right, let's get into our first big idea here. To really get our heads around this paradox, we need a totally new way of looking at things. And it comes from a field called structural cognition. And the first principle is super simple, but really powerful. Help is not neutral. Every single thing you do, every question you ask, it has an impact. Now, the key concept here has a bit of a technical name. It's called external load insertion. But don't let the jargon throw you off. The idea is actually really simple. Anytime you introduce something from the outside, whether it's a question or just your focused attention or even an unspoken expectation, you're placing a demand on the other person's internal system. You're literally adding weight or load to their mental plate. Just think about it for a second. When you ask what seems like a simple question, what's actually happening inside their head? First, their brain has to kick into gear and search its entire internal library for relevant info. Then it has to sort through all the possible answers and evaluate which one makes the most sense. All of that mental work, that searching and sorting, it taxes their system. It adds load. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Because once you start thinking in terms of load, it forces you to look at all your most trusted coaching tools in a completely new light. Which brings us right to section 2, when good tools backfire. Okay, let's start with the biggest sacred cow in the entire coaching playbook, the question. I mean, we are all taught that powerful, insightful questions are the absolute key to unlocking potential. But are they really always clarifying? So the common belief, right, is that a good question creates space for reflection. It opens things up. But if we look at the structural reality, questions don't create space. They demand energy. They force a person's system, which might already be completely overloaded, to perform these really complex operations. And if someone is already struggling to keep their head above water, that extra demand, well, it's not going to lead to clarity. It's going to lead to more confusion. All right, fine. So questions can be tricky. But what about the whole point of asking them? You know, that big aha moment, the glorious insight. Surely that's always a good thing, isn't it? Is insight really the ultimate goal we should be shooting for? Well, here we go again with the paradox. We tend to think of insight as this amazing moment of liberation, right? The clouds part. But structurally, an insight is just a new piece of information. Think of it like a new piece of software that the brain now has to install and integrate with every other program it's running. And that process of integration, you guessed it, it adds more load. And this next part just brilliantly highlights the danger. There's this fantastic line from the source material that says it all. The insight was accurate. The architecture could not hold it. This is so key. It perfectly explains why sometimes a person has this huge breakthrough. They feel amazing, and then a few days later they're completely overwhelmed, anxious, or have slid right back to where they started. The idea was totally right, but their internal system just wasn't strong enough to support the weight of it yet. Okay, so if we start using this lens of structural load, it completely reframes what we think of as failure. We can start to see these common coaching breakdowns not as some kind of psychological flaw, but as totally predictable outcomes. And that's what we're covering in section 3, the anatomy of failure. This is such a crucial shift in perspective. Think about that person we might have labeled as resistant. The structural view says, that's not resistance, that's coherence preservation. Their system isn't fighting you, it's doing something incredibly intelligent. It's protecting itself from a destabilizing amount of load you're trying to add. It's actually a sign of a healthy, self-preserving system, not a flaw. Or how about when a client becomes dependent on their coach? We tend to see that as some kind of emotional neediness. But from a structural point of view, it's structural outsourcing. It makes perfect sense. If the coach is always the one asking the questions and providing the insights that make the client feel stable, well, the client's system learns that stability comes from an external source. It's not a character flaw, it's a learned pattern.
And this is just such a powerful reframe for why people get stuck. We push them to dream big, create these amazing goals and visions for the future. But all of that can introduce this massive future-based load. So often, stalling isn't about a fear of the future. It's that our well-intentioned help has made the future feel incredibly, incredibly heavy. Okay, so if adding questions, insights, and future plans, if adding all this load is the problem, then what in the world is the solution? Well, that brings us to our final section, moving from steering to stabilizing. According to this whole framework, truly effective helping does almost the exact opposite of what many of us were taught. The focus shifts entirely. It becomes about reducing load, not adding more. It's about helping to restore a person's own internal coherence. And, maybe most importantly, it's about returning the job of regulation back to the system itself, back to the person you're trying to help. And this really gets us to the critical difference, the heart of the matter. Most coaching, even when it claims to be non-directive, is still secretly steering. It's trying to guide the person toward a specific outcome. And that act of guiding adds load. But true facilitation is something else entirely. It's about stabilizing the person's internal architecture. It's about reducing the pressure so their own system can find its own path forward. So, if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's this. The solution isn't about finding better questions or pushing for deeper insights. The real skill is developing what we could call structural attunement. It's about learning to sense how much load a person's system can actually handle at any given moment, and then adapting your approach to stabilize them, not to overload them. So I'll just leave you with this final thought to chew on. In your own work, in your own relationships, what would change if you started to believe that the most helpful thing you can possibly do is not to add direction, but to simply remove pressure? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.